Thank you very much for coming along. I'm Ian Brown. I'm Professor of Drama at Kingston University in London. I'm currently Chair of the Scottish Society of Playwrights. I'm currently President of the Association of Scottish Literary Studies, but I think the reason I'm here, apart from all that previous, is that I've just edited a volume, the Edinburgh Companion to Scottish Theatre. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here on this stage because I remember being here 40 years ago, just under 40 years ago. I know I look a lot older than that. When, with great confidence, Toby Robertson and Clive Perry announced the launch of the Scottish National Theatre. And that was in 1973 to be an amalgamation of the Lyceum Theatre Company and Prospect Theatre Company. It didn't happen for all kinds of reasons to do with the politics of theatre companies, but it's a good reminder that the National Theatre arose from a long series of debates and discussions from, certainly I've been able to identify at least 5 attempts in the 20th century to set up a national theatre, starting from before the First World War. So the whole process has been very, very well grounded. It's not just a question of what the National Theatre has come from, but what it actually now shapes itself as. I was just reminding people before we came in here that in 1996, the two chief executives of the joint chief executives of the Lyceum Theatre, that was Kenny Ireland and Nicky Axford, were taken out for lunch by Lord Lindsay and offered £1 million to form a national theatre in the Lyceum. Their response was to say no. And they said no for 2 reasons. One was that they felt it was politically not the right thing, but also because they felt it was wrong theatrically for Scotland. Clive Perry, part of the reason he pulled out in 73 was he argued that the National Theatre in Scotland was the theatre of Scotland. The citizens, Pitlochry, Lyceum, all together. And the genius of the present National Theatre is that through collaboration, that is what it is. It is a particular body, of course, and it has a particular constitution, but it is not one building in one place. And I, for a time, was National Drama Director for the Arts Council of Great Britain, and I know that the National Theatre on the South Bank, in the late 80s, on its 10 million budget, it got from my department, 2 million went out at once on electricity and cleaning. At least our National Theatre doesn't have that problem. But in talking of the campaign that led to this exotic and I think wonderfully diverse National Theatre, of which you form part by being part of this debate, we have to pay tribute to some important figures in the last 20, 30 years. And on my right is one of these, Paul Henderson Scott, who was one of the chief campaigners, along with figures like George Byatt, Donald Smith, and many others, too many to name, in bringing us a national theatre. And on my left, David Greig, who is not just one of the most translated Scottish playwrights, but one of the most translated playwrights from the UK. Last I looked at it, he was translated into 25 to 30 languages, which presumably means he's being produced in those languages, and more are happening. So that the Scottish National Theatre has become an international theatre, and I'm very proud of that. The format will be that for the first part of the evening, Paul will speak to a prepared text, and then David will attempt to cut down his prepared text to something like a reasonable length. Then I will invite them, and I may stimulate them if they don't get on with it, to respond each to the other, and then we'll invite you to join in. And we're assuming that's going to be, in round terms, quarter of an hour, quarter of an hour, quarter of an hour, and quarter of an hour, because there is actually a play happening here tonight, and we do have to, at a certain point, move out. So can I call on Paul Henderson Scott to open the proceedings?
Well, thank you, Ian. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've got a statement here written, which I'm going to more or less read, because so many points I wanted to make. I felt that trying to remember them all might not be the best procedure. The question which we are asked to discuss today is what makes a Scottish play? Well, in a tense, any play written by a Scot is Scottish. But I suppose that we expect more than that. Does it have to be on a Scottish subject, set in Scotland, or to have Scottish characters? Then there's the question of language. Donald Smith, in his contribution to Bill Findlay's A History of Scottish Theatre, says Scotland's trilingualism, Scots, Scots-English and Gaelic, thrives in the context of international cultural diversity in a way that was never able to do under the dominance of an artificially standardized Southern English. The basic reason why the Scottish theatrical tradition is different from the English is because our histories are distinct, and not only in our centuries of resistance to invasion from England. I think that probably the main factor is the effect of our very different traditions in religion and in education. In 1560, John Knox's first book of discipline called for a school in every parish, and there was an enthusiastic response. It was centuries before England and most other countries in Europe had education for the whole population. Then Scotland from early times had universities, which, unlike Oxford and Cambridge, were open to the whole population and not just the wealthy. It used to be said that England had 2 universities and so had Aberdeen. The 2 were eventually amalgamated, but even so, Scotland for centuries had others in St Andrews, Glasgow and Edinburgh. So it's not surprising that our 2 countries still remain very distinct in character and habits and attitudes. Because even after the union, things that matter very greatly to the people's attitude remained distinct in England and Scotland. The churches were quite different, Church of Scotland, Church of England, and they were preserved by the union, not amalgamated. The education system we mentioned, local government we mentioned, and the law were different in the 2 countries. So it's not at all surprising that we have a very different attitude on many things from England. For these reasons, it's not surprising that our theatrical tradition is different from the English, and this applies to Scottish plays in English as well as those in Scots or Gaelic. The exception are plays written by a Scot deliberately in an English style and intended for the London stage. The Scots language is in a curious position. Most of us these days seldom speak a word of it, but we understand and relish it. It had many setbacks. The idea of creating an authorized version of the Bible was first produced at a meeting in a kirk in Burntisland, but when it was undertaken, Jimmy the Sax had moved to London, and it was written with great brilliance in English. That language became the word of God, and any serious work in prose had to be written in it. That did not stop our poets writing in their native tongue. And over the years, most of our best poetry has been written in Scots, and so are many of our best plays and the best dialogue in novels. More recently, the most powerful influence against the use of Scots has been broadcasting controlled from London. When I grew up in Portobello before the 1939 war, you heard Scots spoken wherever you went in the town. Now you have to go into the country to hear it, if you hear it at all. But that has not discouraged the use of Scots in the theatre, particularly in the last 50 years or so. 2 plays in Scots are running in Scottish theatres at present. The National Theatre's production of Ina Lamont Stewart's Men Should Weep, and Liz Lockhead's Mary Queen of Scots Got Her Head Chopped Off. When I think of the plays which I've most enjoyed in Scotland, many of them, most of them perhaps, have been in Scots. I think in particular of those of Robert McClellan, Alistair Reid, Robert Kemp, and Donald Campbell. In 2005, the Association of Scottish Literary Studies published Serving Twa Meisters, 5 classic plays in Scots translation. In their introduction, edited by John Corbett and Ben Findlay, in their introduction and appendices, they gave us an impressive list of the classical plays which have been translated into Scots and produced since 1948, the year in which Robert Kemp's Let's Wives' Tent, a translation of Molière's L'École des Femmes, was first staged. This list of plays contains 30 translations ranging from Aeschylus and Aristophanes to, for instance, Shakespeare, Racine, Chekhov, and Ibsen. In addition, several writers are writing new plays in Scots. Ronald Stevenson, in his book Scottish Theatre since the 70s, published in 1996, said it's probably Scots speech that is the most favoured influence on drama over recent decades. Then, of course, there's the 3 Estates. Sir David Lindsay's play, written in the 16th century and adapted by Robert Kemp for productions in the Edinburgh Festival in 1948, 1973, and 1985. I was fortunate enough to see all 3 of these productions. Joyce Macmillan wrote in The Scotsman on the 16th of March 2007 that they had an electrifying effect on Scottish audiences and artists, alerting them to all the huge forgotten possibilities of the national language and culture. When Brian McMaster became the director of the Edinburgh Festival in 1992, he said in a press conference that because of this great success, and to give an element of continuity to the festival, like Every Man in Salzburg, he would stage the Free Estates every 2 or 3 years. In fact, he never did so, except for a rather poor modern imitation of it. I used to remind him of this promise at the annual press conferences to announce the year's programme. Finally, after the formation of the National Theatre had been announced, he said with an air of relief, "You will not have to wait much longer. It's bound to be one of their first productions." But we're still waiting. The failure of the Edinburgh Festival to stage the Free Estates in 1985 is not the only mysterious delay in the history of the theatre in Scotland. Above all, there's a long history of the campaign for the establishment of a national theatre. In 1987, as the chairman of the Advisory Council for the Arts in Scotland, I arranged a conference which was intended to lead to action at last. I quote from my autobiography. "Virtually every theatre in Scotland was represented. The directors of the national theatres of Iceland and Finland encouraged us by their experience. Theatre directors, actors and writers all spoke, many of them, including David Greig and Tom Fleming, with eloquence and passion. The demand for a national theatre was urgent and unanimous. The chairman of the Scottish Arts Council, Sir Alan Peacock, wrote to me afterwards, "No one could fail to be impressed by the strength of the demand for a national theatre." We therefore expected early action by the Scottish Arts Council. They had, after all, financed the Scottish Theatre Company for several years, and it was widely regarded as a potential national theatre. It was the company under the direction of Tom Fleming which produced the Free Estates in 1985. But so far from promoting the National Theatre, the Scottish Arts Council did the opposite. They caused the collapse of the Scottish Theatre Company by withdrawing its funding, and avoided any decision on the main issue for some years by appointing consultants to write unnecessary reports on the like. Finally, in December 1999, it was a committee of the Scottish Parliament which took action. They invited the theatre directors Hamish Glenn, Giles Havergal, and Kenneth Ireland, and myself to give evidence. We all spoke in favour of the formation of a national theatre, and the committee recommended this in their report. The Finance Minister announced in September 2003 that the National Theatre would go ahead with initial funding of £7.5 million over 2 years. But why had the Scottish Arts Council been so hostile to the idea? A friend of mine, who was a member of their council at the time, told me that the trouble was that the atmosphere within the Scottish Arts Council was unfriendly to Scottish work for the theatre. Both the chairman of the Drama Committee and the head of the department were, he said, anti-Scottish. This may explain many things, including the funding agreement which they drew up to establish the National Theatre. This required them to encourage, stimulate and develop new trends. Not a word about revivals, although the long campaign for its establishment had emphasised them. And in fact, in every national theatre in the world, as far as I'm aware, the revival of important old plays from the past is one of their essential functions. Not their only function, of course, but an essential one. John McGrath makes the point about the need for revivals in a conversation recorded in the book Scottish Theatres in the 70s. One of the big problems with Scottish theatre, he says, is that when a play has been done, even in a small hall in Edinburgh, it's considered undoable by any other theatre in the land. There's a huge pile, hundreds of very good plays, which are never done again. It's quite extraordinary. Towards the end of the campaign for the National Theatre, Donald Smith, in a pamphlet called Scottish Stage, published that pamphlet, which contained a list of a very large number of such plays, mainly from the 20th century. The National Theatre considered this list, but at one point they said they did not intend to stage any of them. But at last, we are now in a new age. The Scottish Arts Council has been abolished and replaced by Creative Scotland, and the National Theatre has started to revive plays from the past.
Thank you. I turn now to David.
Thank you. I want to start with a small story. I was just on the October break with my children in the Highlands, and I was showing them about native Caledonian pine forest, which I'm very fond of. And we were up near Crieff, and I was taking them for a walk, and we saw a little grey squirrel and my daughter wanted to feed it. And I said, let's not feed it. In fact, we should probably shoot it. She was understandably shocked, and I was explaining that the red squirrel, which we actually had seen earlier up further north, was under threat by the grey squirrel. And there was too many grey squirrels, and we should probably kill it. And she said, it wasn't native, I said, and she said, but it's still a squirrel. So, and it is still a squirrel. So, the reason I tell that story is really because I think any project of definition is going to be fraught and open essentially to ridicule. I can't come up with a definition of a Scottish play, nor can anybody, and when we try, we're bound to fail. However, I do think, rather in the same way that we might look at Caledonian pine forest, we might say that if a squirrel's job is to eat nuts and a tree's job is to grow and a writer's job is to write, nonetheless, there are people who create environments or who manage the environments in which the squirrels and the trees and indeed the writers emerge. And so I suppose this discussion, from my point of view, is less a prescriptive thing about artists and more a look from a different perspective, from the point of view of those, if you like, who manage the forests, and trying to perhaps understand the diversity of the work in Scotland, how it came about, and how we might look at engaging with it. I really want to draw on 3 specific 20th century moments. There are so many experts in the audience who will be able to identify the flaws in my argument that I admit in advance it's quite hasty, but I'll zip through it as fast as I can. Ein Satire of the Three Estates has already been mentioned. Produced first in the 1550s, it has a key moment. It's a play spoken out to the audience. It is written in verse. It contains, interestingly, a mixture of high and low language, perhaps not even then regarded as high and low language, but it certainly would be now. It's one of the earliest examples of the word fuck recorded in print, and I was reading it today and noticed also one of the first examples I know of the word cunt being used on a Scottish stage long before Gregory Burke. And I think that's going to be part of what I want to say, is that the seeds of the Scottish Caledonian forest, if you like, are all present in Ein Satire. A mix of high and low, poetic language, directing. There's a key point at the beginning of the second act of the play where a man comes out of the audience, the poor man, the pauper, comes out of the audience and interrupts Diligence, who's trying to begin the second act of the play. And Diligence says to him, "Beggar Bogle, haste away, thou art overpert to spill our play." And the beggar says to him, "I'll not give for all your play worth a sow's fart, for there is richt little play in my hungry heart." And he proceeds to demand alms from the audience. Now, I think that moment of emergence from the audience outwards is onto the stage, and that engagement between the stage and the audience is something that will come to be important during the 20th century. The Renaissance in Scottish literature in the 1930s, partly around the use of Scots language and Lallands, began to emerge, in a sense, as a culture trying to define itself, trying to find itself, and perhaps setting itself against English or England. And that, I think, in the 1949 festival, when the production of Ein Satire happens, I think we can see it coming out of that moment. It's an attempt to say, well, what might a Scottish literature be, and what might a Scottish play be? And in the same way that an English play or English literature might be defined by Shakespeare, there's a hope and a searching for a great canonical work. And one is found, and one is presented, and it's extremely exciting and electrifying, and it produces a range of Scottish plays in response or following on from that, such as some years later, but I think related, The Wallace by Sidney Goodser Smith, another poetic play in Scots. And I think this first attempt to say what might a Scottish play be is looking at the, if you like, the high tradition of poetry. It's looking at historic subjects, and it's directly looking at a Scots, a Lowlands poetic language. Now, around about the 1960s, I think something changes. A new definition is sought, and a bunch of long-haired, hairy-bearded, loon-panted people begin another search, and they do it in a number of different ways. One is musically. I've been very interested in the way that to my grandfather, Scottish music would have been Robert Wilson singing in a rather lovely baritone voice. But to my father, Scottish music would have been the Corries. Not that they didn't have a beautiful baritone voice, but they sang in a profoundly different way, and in a way which was folk-inflected and looked to the people, to the working class, to folk history and tradition, to find another history and another language in which to sing in that instance. But I think folk and theatre become very, very closely intertwined during this period. People like Billy Connolly and so on working together with companies like 784. And I think out of this moment of working class Scots, we find a number of plays such as The Bevellers and The Sash, but we also find obviously The Cheviot and The Stag and the Black Oil, which is a play which suddenly kind of seems to coalesce a huge way of thinking about what a Scottish play might be. It uses folk song, it uses a mix of high and low, it also uses poetry, it uses speech, working class demotic speech, and it becomes immediately defining. I think then the next moment I want to look at is around about the 1980s, around about 1979, 78. A number of things happen. So, if you like, on the one hand, we have the Scottish play as a sort of high art. Then we have Scottish play coming from folk tradition. There's a moment where suddenly along comes John Byrne, and he finds another way. He seems to draw together a language which is neither a naturalistic working class demotic language, but nor is it purely a high poetic language. It is a uniquely Burnian idiolect. And he demolishes the stage with it. It comes onto the stage and you suddenly can't understand how it was ever possible that it wasn't there. Round about that moment, there's also the failed devolution referendum, and so the question of what is a Scottish play becomes, in a sense, important again. What might a Scottish play be? And I think in direct response to Byrne, or at least that environment, out come a whole series of Scottish plays which I think answer the question of what language does our theatre speak, with this answer of a unique idiolect belonging to each writer. So, for example, Chris Hannon is unmistakably Chris Hannon. He is not writing in East Glasgow as it is heard on the street, although that is part of what he's writing. He's also not writing high poetry, although that is part of what he's writing. He's mixing high philosophical thought with low comedy in the way that many of us will be familiar with. I think you find the same with Simon Donald. I think you find the same with Joe Clifford and other Scottish plays of the period. That the answer to the question of do you speak Scots, do you speak English, what language do you speak, becomes I speak myself. I make my own poetry. And I think it was arguable that is, if not uniquely Scottish, it is a particularly Scottish response, and that we can see that I'm not sure that if you took a set of royal court plays, you would be so easily able to identify the author simply from a paragraph of writing. I think the climax of this moment is Mary, Queen of Scots, got her head chopped off, so recently performed here. This is a very familiar quote from it, but I want to read it. It's at the beginning, and again we have the speaking out to the audience, we have the poetry, we have the language. The Corby says, I dinna ken what like your Scotland is, here's mine's. National flower, the thistle. National pastime, nostalgia. National weather, smur, har, drizzle, snow. National bird, the crow, the corby, le corbeau, moi. Now what's interesting about that to me is I counted 4 languages in it. French, English, Norse, Scots. Also, I think you could argue that Doric is in there, and you might make an argument that nostalgia brings in Latin or Greek, I don't know. Anyway, forget it. Okay, so my point being that if you like all the elements, if you think back to Ein Satire, suddenly you see a Scottish play that, just like Ein Satire, contains all those elements again. Once again, we find a Scottish play which is addressed out to the audience, in which there is dialogue between the audience, there is poetry, there is high and low, and philosophy, and it is spoken in non-naturalistic dialogue. I guess to return to my metaphor of the forest, it feels to me that if that's the Caledonian forest, well, what has it emerged from? And I think my argument would be that it has actually come from some of the things which Paul has identified, the marginality of this culture, the differences in language, the archipelagic nature of its different communities, the fact there is no one city that was truly able to dominate any other. I think out of those tensions, artists were required or forced to, if you like, grow in a peculiar way. Rather like the knotty nature of the Scots pine, each author had to find their own way through all of those different restrictions or opportunities. I would like to just quickly draw attention to Gregory Burke's Black Watch, which also contains that speaking out to the audience, that mix of high and low. Gregory's work always contains a mix of the high and the demotic. I noticed that that was performed by the National Theatre at Holyrood for the Parliament, but I also remember a key performance being Glenrothes, the Rothes Halls, where the Black Watch, obviously that's the heart of where the Black Watch recruit. And that just today reminded me of the way in which Ein Satire was both produced at Linlithgow in the 1550s, was produced for the King in Linlithgow, but was also produced in an outdoor performance, which I think we can imagine must have been attended by the public in Cooper in Fife. So I guess what I'm arguing is that there was a refinding of the Scottish play after all of those years, and it is on the back of that which the plays of the 1990s, of which I'm part, and David Harrower and Douglas Maxwell and Nicola McCartney and so on, we emerge out of that. Just to draw that to a close, I'd like to just quote a little bit from Knives in Hens as kind of emblematic of this. I suppose to make the metaphor clear, it's slightly insulting. If the Caledonian pine forest requires bog, I think Scottish theatre requires bog, and I think the bog is the audience. I think it's the peculiarities of the Scottish audience that result in the peculiarities of the Scottish play. And we'll come to this very briefly. I will close shortly. So, in Knives in Hens, we have this lovely bit of dialogue. Very early on, the young woman, the heroine of the play, is talking to her husband, a rather solid fellow, and she says, he says, "What are you standing there? What are you doing?" And she says, I was looking at, I saw a puddle you can see the earth under, clear water puddle after fresh rain, See the cracks in the earth there. See birds' feet. See the sun shining. You got a name for that? And he says, puddle. And she says, no, the right name. And he says, right name's puddle. And she says, how? And he says, you go straight to places, woman. You walk and don't stand. And she says, puddle's dark, mud water, see nothing in it. What was that I saw? Clear shining water, what? Puddle, still puddle. I've said for, dark puddle, clear puddle, it's the same. And she says, things change each time I look at them. So I think in that discussion, how do we name the world around us? This woman's determination to name it herself. Puddle is not good enough. She's going to find her own word for it. I think that, for me, is an example of the idiolect. And David Harrower is an example of a kind of writer who could only really emerge once the work, if you like, had been done of putting these pillars back into place. The first performance of Knives in Hands, there was a post-show discussion that week on Thursday, which I attended, and the debate was, is it a Scottish play? That's what came out, because it's not written in Scots. There's not a Scots word in it, I don't think. But it feels quintessentially Scottish, and this debate raged. David Harrower characteristically said nothing on the matter. However, afterwards, I was standing in the urinals at the Traverse, and next to me was Simon Donald, and he said, two Scottish writers having a pish. But is it Scottish pish? That's the question. And so I suppose returning, my argument would be, or my thought would be, if it's in a Scottish urinal from a Scottish author, no, I guess if it's in a Scottish bog, it's a Scottish play. Thank you.
Can I thank both speakers for sticking so beautifully to time? Can I just throw in one other thought about the 60s and 70s? It's something that we tend to neglect in our neck of the woods, but of course there was a sudden surge of Gaelic playwriting in exactly that period. Ian Crichton Smith wrote work of European dimensions and in the absurdist style from the 60s on, and we should not forget that that was almost part of that broader process. So that if we are talking about trilinguality, let's not forget, although many of us may not speak the Gaelic, that there is also a parallel process going on in the Gaelic-speaking world. Can I invite you, Paul, to make an initial response to David's provocation, as they say in France?
Well, David talks a lot about the Scottish language, but I must confess, I've only seen one of David's plays, which I saw with great pleasure and great admiration, which was Dunsinane. But as far as I remember, it was all entirely in English, was it not?
A little bit of Gaelic, but yes, it was.
Yes, but you see, that seemed to me to have missed quite an important point, because there were scenes when the English army and the Scottish population were confronting one another. But it would have been quite interesting if they were distinguished by linguistically as well as just being there. Now, I don't say that every play in Scots, Scottish plays don't have to be in Scots or in Gaelic or anything like that. They can easily be in English. I'm not saying that it's essential, but one of the characteristics of some of our best plays is the fact that they're in Scots. And nobody's saying for a moment that every play has to be in Scots, of course not. Nobody's saying that everybody understands and appreciates it, of course not. Many people have been brought up in their schools to ignore it and forget it as a barbarous tongue. But nevertheless, it's a very great asset in the theatre, it seems to me, because it's such an expressive language. To some extent, in comparison, English seems wrong. In fact, I remember people, quite a long time ago now, I can't even remember who it was, but at the time of the MacDiarmid, there were people saying that, writing essays and publishing essays, saying that the trouble with English was now to become an international language. It had lost all character. It was devoid of its emphasis to be easily understood and easily spoken by people like announcers in airports and things all over the world. It had to become an international speech, and therefore a speech devoid of character or power to express opinions and feelings more than opinions. Well, I think that's exaggerated, of course, but there's a certain element of truth in it. That one of the reasons why Scots is very good in the theatre is simply because it's not the language you hear every day of the week, and you listen to it with great pleasure and appreciate its effectiveness and its the way in which it expresses feeling and so on. So we shouldn't get obsessed with this question of language. I mean, plays can be Scottish, can be very Scottish indeed, if there's not a word of Scots in them. Language is only one of the factors that exists in the Scottish theatre, not the essential one.
David?
I agree with that. I mean, and I agree, I would wholeheartedly say that Scots, in all the different forms in which it comes, is a resource for the writer. I suppose what I like and enjoy personally, but also I enjoy in other writers, is that mixing or that clash, which I do think I find exciting on a Scottish stage. As I say, of bilinguality or trilinguality, even in some contexts, where the formal English of which is both, it has been the English of power, for example, comes up against Scots, but then that could be a working class Scots, it could be a Doric Scots, it could be a Highland Scots, and so on. So I enjoy that. The other thing I wanted to pick up from what Paul said earlier on is that Paul identified or discussed the possibility of an anti-Scottishness in the Scottish theatre, and I think that it would be very easy to sort of dismiss that and sort of say, no, I don't think that's true. I think there is an anti-Scottishness in the Scottish theatre in a way, but I think it is as much comes from Scots themselves historically, and even continuing. It's whatever, we might call it the cringe, or there's all kinds of ways we discuss it. My slightly controversial point is I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing always. I think it has been bad at points in the past, but I think it sometimes gives us the strength of our own marginality, by which I mean we know that we are not the centre of things, and therefore we're able to be on the outside. If we were too confident, too defined in our selfhood, there's a danger we might then become fixed or, dead.
It's where MacDermot said, let me be where extremes meet.
Yes.
It's coming together. Paul.
Yeah.
I think one other thought, just arising from that, and perhaps I can offer it to Paul and to David to respond to, is this issue of the autonomy of the artist. I think we're moving to a position where actually there's an outbreak of harmony. God help us. But presumably, what one is going to be driven by the artist's language. The artist must write in the language that suits. I'm thinking, for example, of a great playwright like Stuart Conn, whose poetry is almost entirely in English, and most of whose plays, not all of them, but most of them are in Scots. Mm-hmm. Do you want to respond to that, perhaps, Paul?
Well, I suppose that if you're writing a play, you wanted to appeal to the audience, you wanted to affect the audience, you want people to react favourably to it, or find this as very interesting, or very stimulating, or very amusing, or whatever. And it seems to me that, not necessarily, I mean, it depends on the individual using the language, but it seems to me that many people can be more can achieve these results in Scots more easily than they can in English. Mm-hmm. It may be because their Scots has associations with them, their childhood or whatever, that English doesn't have, or it may be because they've been brought up to speak proper. Didn't say that, speak proper, and which the schools have been trying to eliminate the Scots language from Scotland for quite a long time, and therefore it's a kind of liberation if you suddenly find that you can actually speak Scots and you can listen to Scots without anyone telling you to, that's not right. And that's a factor in all this. But I don't think it's in any way essential, it's not essential for Scottish plays to be in Scots. A play can be very Scottish and express lots of Scottish ideas and Scottish attitudes without a word of Scots in it. But I think it is nevertheless an important quality which has a great effectiveness in the theatre and is worth preserving for that reason.
As a writer, as a playwright, David, do you find yourself searching for other languages, or is it that you just find this is your idiolect and that's the way forward?
I have an odd position, and in fact the first plays I wrote were very specifically set in foreign countries. Part of the reason for that was because I wanted to write characters who, had I written them as Scottish people, would not have spoken with my voice. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't very confident with, I felt slightly like I was imitating something. Mm. So by writing plays which gave the impression they were in translation, I was able to sidestep that. And in fact, what happened was, with sort of growing confidence as time has gone on, that sort of slightly slipped away, and I felt more able to address the stage however I wish to address it, and not feel too worried about those specificities. I think there's something, though, for me that is lurking under this as well, which is it's a sort of victory, oddly, but it's almost gone unnoticed. So my daughter, of the squirrel fame, she ironically, in the playground in the ordinary school in Fife where she goes, she doesn't really speak Scots. But in the classroom, she does. She's taught it in the classroom, and she has to learn Scots poems. She has to learn how to speak and understand Scots plays. I think that's a very good thing. I mean, but it'll be curious to see in 10 to 15 years' time whether, in a sense, the new generation of writers have an even different attitude than, say, David Harrower or myself, who felt, as I say, I think we unquestionably felt the opening of a territory that we did not need to, if you like, reconquer. We could go in whichever direction we chose, and it would be fine. But that was on the back of, as Vicky said earlier on, it was on the back of previous work.
It raises the interesting image of 10 years' time, the children using the high prestige Scots language, but in the playground using the gutter language English.
The gutter language English is quite. I think to some degree, that new languages are coming in. I mean, new languages are being put. But do you know what I do think, however, is that the audience here, I think we do not have the same. We're too small a country. It's too possible to have in the same audience people of power, wealth, influence, and so on, and in quotes, ordinary working class people or so on. This mixing. Edinburgh's not a big enough city to have a theatre like this and not have levels of mixing that I think bigger cultures, bigger cities don't necessarily need to have, and people can go into their bunkers and they can speak their own languages to each other and say their own things to each other without the need to kind of communicate across the way. And I do think that the Scots, the situation of culture in Scotland at the moment, without being complacent, does that mixing of language and is demanded and welcomed and is a healthy sort of.
That's a very good moment as we talk about the mixing of language and the mixing of cultures and the mixing of audience to open up. It reminds me too that in 1972, which next year will be 40 years ago, in this very auditorium, Bill Brighton's Willie Ruff opened, and I remember Alan Wright's review talked of it as an extraordinary explosion from the stage of language, and it was, it sold out. I mean, those of us, I know there are very few around here, is old enough to remember the early 70s, and if you can remember it, you weren't there. But it was, as you remember, a sensation, and people were coming who were coming because they could hear their language on stage, who had never been to the Lyceum except perhaps for the panto. But I'm going to ask if the house lights can be brought up slightly, and I'm going to invite questions from the audience. We have, as I say, about a quarter of an hour, and miraculously we're to time.
I was interested in the point that you made on the historical period of Scotch drama. Admittedly, during the Reformation, it was phased out, but Sir Walter Scott and his novels created a terrific interest in Scottish theatre, and a lot of his novels were transposed into plays. I'm told at one point the Queen and the Queen Mother were at one of these transposition plays in the 20th century, and the Queen Mother, being Scotch, took the side of the Scots and the Queen the side of the English. And that was something that you did gloss over, but I think it is a key aspect of Scots and the development of Scots literature and drama in the early 19th century onwards into the 20th.
The national drama, Walter Scott adaptation that was called the national drama, as you remember, and was extremely popular and ran through that whole century. And indeed, in that production you're mentioning, the Queen was here with the King of Norway. It was a royal gala performance. It's a lovely thought that they did Rob Roy then. I think there was a gentleman in the white. Yeah.
It's to do with this, you're stating that Scottish theatre, because of its circumstances, sort of forced an individualism. Whereas from what I can see, at the same time, this was happening all over. We had people like Bond, we had, in Europe, we had Havel, Mrozek, each one speaking with quite an individual voice. So what is it, are you saying, that makes what was happening in Scotland different from what it seems to me was happening all over in lots of countries?
I think that's a very fair point. There are writers. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of writers in other languages because, in languages other than English, because I don't know to what extent, I'm experiencing them in translation. But as for the English and Welsh and Irish and American theatre, you can certainly find people like Bond who use mixtures of high and low and who address outwards as well as, and who speak in a non-naturalistic heightened language. I suppose if I'm going to make an argument, I would say that I think it was less part of the mainstream, if you like, certainly of the London theatre. Similarly, in New York, I think we find experiments, but those experiments and those linguistic, those experiments are perhaps there formally, but they're less. Obviously there are going to be problems of definition, but I think that a play like Cheviot set against a play like Saved, one is, if you like, more populist or more outward with the audience in its address, and perhaps less confrontational, perhaps less imagining an audience of bourgeoisie who need to be baited, and more an audience with whom something might be shared. But having said that, I think for every example I could give, there must be a counterexample.
It seems to me that, the difference between the position of Scots and the unofficial language in other countries is the fact that Scots in the 16th century was a very developed language, and it was the vehicle of some of the greatest poetry. Some of the greatest poetry in Europe in the 16th century was being written in Scotland by people like Dunbar. And so it's not just a kind of vulgar debasement of a language, it's a language on its own. It had a common origin with English, no doubt.
I think too that we talked about Stuart Conn a minute ago. It's that tension. I mean, I know in my own practice as a poet, I wrote some poems for Joan Knight as she was dying, and some were in English and some were in Scots. And the division was very much about, as if you're a Scottish writer and if you're a Scottish speaker, as many of us here are, a speaker in Scotland, is you're constantly working between registers, between idiolects, between dialects, between languages. And that is not something that happens in the same sense in England. I work in England. I teach Bond, actually. And it's a different tension for the creative writer. and I think therefore for the native speaker.
But the tension in someone like John Byrne, which I think is a very defining one or Chris Hannon would be the one that I first encountered. I do remember absolutely the first moment of reading Chris Hannon, and that feeling to me like a door opening as to, you know, which that tension is between. It is about not being able to fix upon one direction, but claiming them all in one fell rhetorical swoop.
I was very struck recently going to see The Missing, and sitting in the tramway watching it, having earlier in the year produced 2 plays from the Missing Theatre in Buenos Aires. And it seemed to me that the response of the audience to both experiences was as enthusiastic and engaged, and they didn't make a great distinction in their minds between the fact that one lot of plays were written by Argentinians and the other was written by a Scot from Ayrshire. And in fact, I think the great thing about contemporary Scottish theatre is that we now have the ability to embrace plays from wherever they come and call them part of the Scottish theatre experience.
Yeah, very good. I think Mark Fisher, who's sitting here, once said that Michel Tremblay was a Scottish playwright that Scotland had never had, because we had him through translation. A phrase he's never been able to live down. More questions? Did I see someone? Well, I'll take privilege and ask another question then. What seems to me to be emerging almost out of this debate is that, and taking the point that's just being made, is that what has happened is that by defining and creating a national theatre, in the process that led to a national theatre is also an internationalising of that theatre. It seems to me what's just been said is that. So how would you know if a Scottish playwright now wrote a play that wasn't Scots? What would that mean? How could you... Do you remember that McCaig was accused of being a quisling because he wrote in English? Is it conceivable now that we could have that kind of statement made, or have we completely left that behind? Paul?
Well, I don't really know. This is a very lively subject, isn't it? Because it's changing the whole time. Attitudes towards these things are changing all the time. I think most of us have probably been brought up in schools in Scotland where we were told it was, a vulgar language that we shouldn't actually use. And now it's regarded as an artistic asset of great importance. And this is really quite confusing, I think, to a lot of people. They don't know quite where we stand. But language is not the only, the only matter that affects Scottish plays. There are other differences as well. I think one of the differences is actually the fact that Scotland is a very egalitarian society. It has been for centuries, for all kinds of obvious reasons. The church had a big influence on this, because if you compare, the church doesn't have the sort of influence now that it used to have, but if you think of the influence of the church even in the very recent past, and of the difference between Scotland and England, the churches. The England church was a hierarchical church. It was run by the king. It had bishops and people all dressed up in elaborate robes and things like that. And the Church of Scotland, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of that. It was a very democratic church, always has been. And that perhaps is one of the major influences, one of the major reasons why Scotland and English attitudes are so different. But this is not a disadvantage. It's a great advantage, actually, for literature and for the theatre. It's another whole subject to explore. And it's quite obvious as we think about this and talk about it, it's quite obvious that the subject is very, very complex indeed, and there's no simple answer to any of it.
I think there's another question.
Lots of interesting things that have come out of this. I think, David, your description of the sort of managed environment is really quite interesting. I would say, having run the Traverse at the time of the sort of 80s, that a lot of this is to do, a lot of what makes a Scots play is places for the plays to be put on, the number of commissions, the number of times things can be put on. The key difference of 20 years ago is that there was hardly any plays commissioned, and those plays that were commissioned were hardly ever put on. And I think whether I'm ambivalent about if there's such a thing as a Scots play myself, but I think I do a lot of work outside of Scotland, particularly in Ireland. And what people in Ireland will now say is that there is a Scots play, and that's because of the volume of plays that are written, that are produced, and then are presented in different languages. And so other people outside of Scotland are the people who are saying there is a Scots playwright, there is a Scots play. Frankly, I'm sort of with Dave on this. I actually don't know in Scotland if it's even relevant. If I think about all the great, plays of the Traverse, the Simon Donalds, Joe Cliffords, Chris Hands, etc., they were brilliant, but equally good with the productions of Manfred Karge and, Trombley, etc. And because one of the things we haven't talked about tonight, and we won't, because this is about the play and the playwright, is the critical point that the real part of our canon that I think most of us could stand up and talk about is about the play in production. Cheviot and the Stag, it wasn't about the play. The play was part of it. It was part of the production. Blackwatch, good play, but it was the production. There are some exceptions. John Byrne is an artist, and his work is about the artist speaking, and the production comes second. But I would say that our tradition, our canon, is to do with the overall performance and production, and that the sort of narrowness of this debate, which is about writing in Scots or not, write Scots plays, is actually a red herring.
Yes, absolutely. It would certainly be that if we were narrowing it that, but we're saying it can be English, it can be Scots, it can be Gaelic.
Can I just back up what Anne said there? That actually those points are the ones that struck me, and it was actually thinking about the responding to your question, Ian, about what is not a Scottish play. That about just over a week ago, 10 days ago, I was at the Salon project in Traverse, dressed up in 19th century costume and looking gorgeous. And in it, Stuart Lang, who produced and directed, designed and was the auteur of the whole thing, said, I am Scottish, I was born in Scotland, I was educated in Scotland, I've worked in Scottish theatre, I live in Scotland, and yet when I talk about my work to some people in Scotland, I'm told I'm not Scottish enough. Now, I think that Anne's right, that problem exists only in Scotland. Nobody outside Scotland would suggest that he wasn't a Scottish auteur or whatever he calls himself, whichever he's doing. But actually there's a kind of, because in a way he wasn't working with text in this case, but other times he has worked with text, it just doesn't feel Scottish to some people. And I think that's quite an interesting, and perhaps it's because it comes from that tradition, which isn't the tradition that David so cleverly outlined. It's from the tradition that came out of the citizens. It's the tradition of that aesthetic within theatre, as opposed to the tradition that was just about the text. So, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anything that's been said, but I think it's quite interesting if we start, as Anne suggests, kind of looking beyond just the text into how it's actually done, and just be careful we don't narrow our discussion about what is a Scottish play down to something.
I think that's very helpful in contribution, and I think it's worth remembering that the citizens' aesthetic was created in part by a Lune fé Elgin and a Gage fé Edinburgh. I think we've time for one. Sorry, David.
Well, I just would like to draw in that I agreeing with those points, but just to say that I think it's a key that we are able to look at it from both angles. I mean, by which I mean the tree simply grows, but there is still we do have a responsibility that we hope that there will be a forest in which we can walk, and I guess all I'm saying is that an understanding of the environment that produces certain types of work will help us in continuing. But I think the overwhelming note, which is the one you pointed out so clearly, is that if we're not producing plays here for our audience, if we are not able to do that, then there is nothing we can talk about. It doesn't exist. the problem of definition that Ian points out, I think is absolutely right. I think that to define in those terms is not helpful. But one small point I would make about the accusation of being not Scottish enough, which is one that, if I haven't had that thrown at me directly, I have felt occasionally. I think one thing that has very much strengthened me on that recently was the discovery and the enjoyment of that in Scottish international tradition, particularly in poetry, that comes out of W.S. Graham, Kenneth White, Trochy, Jim Haynes, i.e. the sense of R.D. Laing, the sense of the outward international thinking. And I would argue that that's another tension that we find within the culture that I find fruitful. But of course, any culture is going to have those tensions. It's just this happens to be the one in which I'm operating.
I know that Andrew Marvell talked about Time's Winged Chariot. I feel the stage manager's heavy breath. We're approaching the point where we must draw together. If I can take Chairman's privilege just to make a couple of comments. One of the things that I hear enormously different because of my great age now, from when I was beginning in the 60s, is a complete relaxedness about Scottish theatre. In 57, Alexander Reid, one of the Renaissance writers who, with MacLellan and Kemp, was trying to find a way of using Scots on the stage, talked of, and they were using this Lallands, what technically is called synthetic Scots, said, if Scotland is ever to become part of world theatre, which in the 50s was a big call, he said, it may happen even in the language of Sauchiehall Street, Glasgow, or Kirkgate, Leith. Now, I would say it has. I would certainly point to Willie Ruff as being critical in this step, certainly the work of John Byrne. Certainly now, perhaps the most known Scottish play worldwide must be Black Watch, which is in the language of not even of Leith or Glasgow, but Glenrothes. And my own feeling about this is that we need to just chill. If Stuart Lang isn't Scottish, where the hell was he get his name from? I mean, Stuart Lang? Can I thank our speakers? Can I thank Paul for his interesting disquisition? Can I thank him also for his championing over decades, difficult decades? It's easy now to think that we've got there, that it was easier than it ever was to lead us to be able to be in this room having this conversation as the national theatre and the national audience, of which and no theatre exists without the audience. And can I thank David especially for his contribution, because he makes me feel really ancient. I have this, it's not a joke actually. When I go into meetings now with Peter Arnott, Peter says, speaking, he says, as a senior playwright. And I think, if he's a bloody senior playwright, what am I? But can I thank David for his sprightly contribution, and can I thank you for coming?